What's up, YouTube? It's the Action Figure Grader coming back to you with another market analysis video. You guys seem to like the last one I did on the vintage Kenner items. I've had it up for less than a day, and it's already like 500 some views and 78 or 80 hours watched. So clearly the market has spoken, so to speak. And I'm going to do another one right now on the vintage collection. And what I want to talk about today are obviously some eBay sales prices here recently. But I'm going to make the argument that there's potential in the market for those that buy and sell and things like that. Not that I do that, but I think that there is an underserved segment. Let me adjust this camera just a little bit. There's an underserved segment for the vintage collection, and I've got some other kind of trends that I wanted to talk about. So let's go ahead and dig right in. The first one I've got in turn, these are all sales price, sold eBay sales. The first one I want to talk about is this one, the Vintage Collection Republic Trooper. This was a two of them in one auction, and this one sold for $450. And the reason I bring this one up is obviously the vote from the vault just happened, and the Republic Trooper was named the winner. So we're going to be getting a repack of the Republic Trooper, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the prices with this one. And they've been hovering, you know, for a single one in really good condition. They've been kind of hovering between 250 or 225 and 275. I've seen as high as 300, but that's kind of an outlier. But anyway, this one sold. It was two of them, and it sold for $450. So $225 a piece plus $20 shipping. So $235 a piece, let's call it. And one of these wasn't even that mint. If you look at this photo here, you can see how that one's got a crease on it. So is the Republic Trooper, the first release, going to drop in price? I think you'll probably see it drop a little bit. You know, there's always going to be, like I've talked about in the past, there's always going to be some collectors that want that first issue. And this one just sold May 9th, so fairly recently. And probably, I'm assuming that's probably after the vote from the vault was winner was announced. So, you know, whenever I do another one of these kind of TVC updates, we'll take a look at that to see prices since this video airs, and what the price has done with the Republic Trooper, the original release, and just see if it drops at all. But I was surprised that this one actually did sell. There was only one bidder, but given that pretty major crease there, you know, it's a surprising price. The next one on my list is a VC56 Kithaba. This is the one with the red bandana. You know, it's a much more difficult figure to find. You can see that there. Obviously, there's two different versions. There's the brown and the red bandana. But the price on this one blew my mind. Now, this was back March 2nd when it closed. You can see it there. But it had 32 bids, and it sold for $321. So that's a pretty massive price for a vintage collection figure. I mean, that's more than what I paid for my Ahsoka, admittedly, probably 6 months, five or 6 months prior to that. But that just shows you how much it's gone up. But you take a look at this one. This is the same figure, and I think this one actually was not in as good a condition, but maybe it was. It was about the same condition. But this one happened just much more recently, about a month and a half later, and this was also in an auction and also in very good condition. And that one sold for $265, including shipping. So $265 versus $321, you know, let's call that $50 different. I mean, that's a 15% or so difference in price, a price drop. So, you know, I guess potentially this one is going to go down as an overpay, but I'm still at $255 for this. It's an awesome figure. Don't get me wrong. I'd love to have it one day, but that's a pretty big number in my opinion. All right, so now let's do. I'm gonna cover a couple of the heavy hitters. I don't want to focus solely on the heavy hitters for this video, but I made a prediction in a live stream with fellow YouTuber the Blacked Out Ewoks, and I said that Ahsoka, non-graded, would be the very first vintage collection figure to hit $1,000 ungraded. And I might be wrong. I might be wrong, folks, because the Canadian variant for VC20 Yoda, and you can see that here, it's got the alternate card back with the, you know, him sitting on the log like in, I guess, The Empire Strikes Back. There's been a couple of, I wouldn't call it super recent sales, but this one was in February, and that one sold for $712 US plus another $28 shipping. So let's call it $740. And then this one sold, let's see, that one sold April 22nd, so a little bit more current data. That one sold for $786 plus, so over $800. So that one is creeping up. Now, 5 months ago, this figure, I could have had it, and I actually bid on a couple that sold in that $500 range. So it's gone from, let's call it 500 to 550 to 750 to 800 now, for that VC20 with the alternate card back, the Canadian version. So pretty amazing. And will this one hit $1,000 ungraded? Only time will tell. But, you know, my prediction was Ahsoka, just given with Disney Plus, you know, the show coming out and things like that. The interest in Ahsoka, just, you know, her comics, things like that, have all just been jumping through the stratosphere. So let's take a look at her now. This one was in pretty good shape, but certainly not perfect. And you can see some pretty heavy wear on the card there on the bag. Not super heavy, but this is probably like an 80 or an 80 plus grade Ahsoka VC102. That one sold in April for $828 plus shipping. So let's call it roughly $850. And this one, oh yeah, I'll talk about that one in a second. But this price is one of the higher prices. I have seen a couple of them sell a little bit lower than that, 700 to 750-ish. But this one was April 2nd. I think there's been a couple after that have sold a little bit lower than that. But it's around the same price point as VC20 Canadian Yoda. And so it's going to be neck and neck to see which one of those hits $1,000 ungraded first. There's been several sales of the Ahsoka graded for above $1,000. I think it's high. There's been a couple on Facebook that have sold as high as $1,500, believe it or not. And the Yoda, I have seen a couple graded that have sold over $1,000, but ungraded, where the buyer is taking all the grading risk if they wanted to grade it. I'm not saying everyone's grading, of course, but you know, this one was certainly not near mint plus. I mean, this was near mint at most, probably an 80 plus, and that one sold for $845 ish. So we'll see which one of those hits, you know, hits the $1,000 mark. But I also wanted to show you this one. This one blew my mind. Now this one is just the card back, you know, cut off the bubble with the figure 100% complete in a baggie. That one actually sold for $315 on April 25th. That is what I paid for my Canadian, my Canadian Ahsoka that got a 90 with Collector Archive Services mint on card. That's what I paid for that, same price. And that just shows, even loose, and they're selling for $300 now, the original Ahsoka, which is, I mean, that to me is pure insanity. But those are the big boys for the vintage collection. But I want to talk more about where I think the market is going, and that's the more interesting kind of discussion, in my opinion. Everyone knows prices are high right now, but where is the vintage collection going? Is it going to see a drop? Is it going to see an increase? And my argument is, if all else is equal, vintage Kenner has had such a massive run up, as I showed in my recent video. The prices are very expensive and well outside of the pocketbooks of the average collector, I would say. You know, it's for mint on card figures especially. It's just gotten really, really expensive. So you have that factor combined with vintage collection being more and more popular. They're releasing figures that people want, gaming greats, repacks, you know, all kinds of interesting figures as it relates to Disney Plus content, like The Mandalorian. There'll be an Ahsoka wave, I'm sure, or more than one wave. And that's bringing in new collectors. So what's that going to do to prices for some of these older figures as new collectors get into the market? You know, and for the generation after me, I'm getting old, folks. I'm an old man. But the generation after me, the millennials and so forth, this is what they grew up with. They grew up with the vintage collection dating back to the original releases in 2010. And now here we are 11 years later. And as millennials age and as they develop a career and, you know, get maybe a more substantial financial footing under them, just as my generation, Generation X did, Generation Y even, um, how does their collecting change? And I think that the signs are there that, there's going to be probably, in my opinion, you got vintage Kenner, which certainly attracts my market. But as we age out and as we fill up with space, which is what I'm doing, what's the next generation going to want to collect? Are they going to want to collect the vintage Kenner? And many have argued that they're probably going to skip right over the vintage Kenner given the prices and start with their high-end collections with the vintage collection. And I think that there's data points that I'll show you here in a second that support that. Obviously, this data that I've already shown you supports that they're willing to pay up for these rarer and pricier examples within the vintage collection line that, and certainly there's collectors like me that are still collecting it. But I think that next generation, they're going to be really attracted to filling out their collection with some of these higher priced items as their finances change and as they mature and get older and their collecting budget increases. So the reason I say that is because I think there's going to be a price equalization, maybe not equalization, but as the vintage Kenner items kind of level off potentially, does that bring up the prices of vintage collection? Does that bring it up closer to vintage Kenner prices? No one knows the answer to that, and certainly the broader economy will play a role in all of these collectibles. The next time we have a massive economic slowdown or a recession, or some other kind of economic altering event like a pandemic or a massive Great Recession like we had in 2008, there'll be a slowdown, of course. But I would argue that the slowdown in the vintage collection will be less. It will be less, and maybe I'm wrong, but on a percentage basis, if you say right here is where vintage collection is right now, and then up here is where vintage Kenner items are, I think that the percentage drop in the prices of vintage Kenner items will be more substantial than the percentage drop of vintage collection figures during the next slowdown in collectibles. Only time will tell whether I'm right or not. But I think that's what you're going to see, because it's a natural byproduct of the price points too, right? A lot of the modern vintage collection, the current waves that we're getting now, it's price affordable. Even collector grade items are $17 with Big Bad Toy Store right now. So your entry point is much lower than vintage Kenner mint on card figures. And so as things slow down, yes, we'll probably see a bigger drop, a bigger percentage drop in the original vintage collection line from 2010 to 2012, just because those are still fairly expensive now. But I think the newer stuff will probably hold its value pretty well, just because it can't go much lower, right? But I've got some interesting data points that I also wanted to point to, and this revolves around graded vintage collection items. When I started grading TVC figures, mint on card figures last year, and last year was really when I started, it was a byproduct of my current financial situation. Everything was shut down. I'm in real estate. I couldn't show or sell houses. My wife was laid off. So our income dropped dramatically during that slowdown. And I thought to myself, how can I still collect during this slowdown? And I had a lot of points built up on my credit card that are for use, that I could use with retailers. And I'm talking like 6, 7, 8 years worth of points on my credit cards. I just never used them. I didn't care about them. But all of a sudden, those points became pretty important to me, because I was able to go to Big Bad Toy Store or Dorkside Toys and basically essentially collect modern TVC items for free. It was all just built up credit card points. We weren't going anywhere. We weren't going out to dinner. And so I used those points to buy some fairly modern vintage collection items. And I said, well, let's go ahead and get them graded. And I was able to use points for that as well, for the grading cost, believe it or not. And I think my argument is with graded vintage collection items is that I've been proven right, that it was a good decision to do that, because the market, at least the data I'm looking at here that I'll show you in a second, proves that there is demand for graded vintage collection items, and there's not enough supply of it. For every, I would call it 300 vintage collection. I did the rough math. I actually did this because I'm a nerd. I looked at, okay, what was the total number of sales of mint on card vintage collection items last month? And then of that percentage, what was the total percentage of those that were graded? And it's like a 30-to-1 ratio, if not higher. I kind of gave up on the math because it became so high. But the prices for the graded vintage collection items, even fairly new ones, not the old waves, I'm talking about the new stuff, shows that there's demand for it. And so this is the first example. This is an original release, vintage collection VCO4 Luke Bespin, unpunched with the Boba offer. Now, this is not that expensive of a figure, really. It really is not. You can get this one. I've seen it fairly recently for sale, mint on card, in great shape, near mint plus condition. I could have picked it up for $50, $60 max. Believe it or not, that's true. And this one sold for $510 with shipping. And it was graded AFA 9.0. That's not even uncirculated, as you can see here. So this was a circulated figure. So not a direct case, and that still sold for $510, which is mind-blowing to me. So the demand is there, even for figures that were in the original release that are not particularly that hard to find or expensive. But let's take the more interesting data is when you start looking at current releases, and these all sold early May. It was the same seller, and this was a VC 126 Imperial Assault tank driver. If you follow the Boss Bounty and Only One Kenobi and some of those other channels, they've all talked about how this thing has skyrocketed. Well, this is uncirculated, but it's 9.25. But look at that sales price. It sold for $260. I mean, that's really, really high to me. You can pick that up even now with the price jump it's made. Let's call it $70 to $85 max. And it would be circulated if you got it graded. But how much of a premium are you really giving for the uncirculated designation versus one that's in high grade? And I would argue that premium for having the U grade versus a normal circulated grade can't be that much, given that we had this Luke that was a non-uncirculated item that sold for $510. This one sold for $260. Some other really eye-popping ones were Rey. This one obviously has gone up, but it's come back down a little bit. You can pick this one up for, I'd say, $50 to $75 now. It jumped up to like $200 for a little while there. But VC 116, the Force Awakens version. Now, this is the Jakku version, so I stand corrected. I was actually referring to the Rise of Skywalker version, but this Rey Jakku is not particularly expensive. And this one sold for $257, a U 9.0. So that was pretty surprising, given that this is a fairly new figure for a movie line within the TVC line that was not particularly popular. The Rey from the Rey from the second film, The Last Jedi, is the one that's gone up quite a bit. This one has not. This one also is another one where it really surprised me. And if you guys remember my character profile on Dr. Aphra, I was somewhat surprised that the Dr. Aphra vintage collection figures are as inexpensive as they are, given the hype around her comic. Her first appearance comic can sell for $400 to $500 now. But her vintage collection figures, even the SDCC exclusive 3-pack, can be found for very inexpensively. $75 for the 3-pack. And even now, the Dr. Aphra ungraded, you can pick up for $25 to $40 easily in near mint plus condition. This one was a U 9.0, and it sold for $256. So this is an example of, you can pick one up for let's call it worst case $50, spend another $40 in grading, and hopefully you get a 9.0 or above. But this is selling for $256. I mean, that to me is really, really surprising. And to me, it's evidence that there is unmet demand for graded vintage collection figures, even the newer releases like I'm showing you here. Some other really surprising ones. Now, again, these are high grade, so take that for what you will. But this one was a 9.75 uncirculated original issue Mandalorian, which that is in plentiful supply. That one was listed for $13.50, and best offer was accepted. You used to be able to look up using kind of some coding what the eBay prices, the actual sales price was, but eBay has since blocked that or changed that code, so you can't look that up anymore. But I would bet it's probably over $1,000 at least, if probably more like $1,100 to even $1,200 for that sold price. And it was a 9.75, so that's a really, really high high grade item, but that's not a particularly hard to find one. And then finally, before I share, I wanted to share one other final thought as it relates to population of these types of items. This one was a combination of the Mandalorian, a U9.5, and Cara Dune, a U9.5. Both of those are, the Cara Dunes come back down in price. It got expensive right after the announcement with Disney, but it's since come way back down. I mean, you can pick one up even fairly recently for, let's call it $35 to $50. These were both U9.5, so that's a very high grade, but that sold for $1,500 for those two figures. So again, this is evidence that there is demand for very high grade, even modern, very recent release TVC figures. And here's my argument as to why I don't expect this to change. Certainly prices could come down during the next recession, but look at the number of vintage Kenner items that were made during the heyday of Kenner's run in the 1980s. If you watched that documentary on Netflix, The Toys That Made Us, I believe is the name of it, they were pumping out millions upon millions of mint on card Kenner items back in the day. And of course, some of them were open and things like that. But I would argue that the population of vintage Kenner items is much more significant than the Hasbro Vintage Collection line, because Hasbro tends to control supply, right? They do everything in waves. It's not like, for certain popular characters like the Mandalorian, they're certainly pumping out more of those than they are of, Queen Amidala in her Queen outfit, But I would still argue that even the Mandalorian, which is probably one of the more popular recent figures in their waves, the number of these produced are nowhere near the vintage Kenner line. And so you got a limited population, and within the vintage collection, you got an even more limited number of people that are actually grading these. So, and the prices show that the demand for very high grade vintage collection items is there. It's just food for thought. I'm not making a particular point. I'm not saying everyone should go out and grade their vintage collection items, but to a certain extent, it validates my decision to get some of my collector grade vintage collection figures graded. That's it's just the data supports that. Anyway, if you guys enjoy these types of videos, I would really appreciate a like and a subscribe. If you want to see more of them, we can make this a regular occurrence, both with the vintage Kenner line as well as with the vintage collection line. I try to keep the information fairly current, but doing these, once a month or so is certainly fun to do, and I hope you enjoy watching it. Thank you again for watching, and I'll be back soon.